Hello, welcome back to part 3. Let's choose the rim and control click on the canvas to mask this object. Head over to the gear and pick the cylinder 3D with an H divide of 48. Control click on the canvas to invert the mask and split unmasked points. Disable dynamic and give the cylinder a 90-degree rotation on the Y-axis. Scale it down to fit the hole and then scale it in the Z-axis. Now we can turn on solo mode and select the slice curve brush. We're going to make a slice down each side and then Q-mesh the polygroup island. Turn on symmetry in the X-axis and pick the ZModeler brush. Switch to Inset Flat Island. Then we can select Q-mesh polygroup island and punch it inwards a bit. Tapping Alt while Q-meshing lets you change the polygroup. Toss in a few edge loops using Insert Multiple Edge Loops. Next up, choose the polygroup to unmask. Snap it to the front view and grab the Clip Curve brush. Turn on symmetry with a radial count of 6. This technique also works great for creating bolts and nuts. Let's select Mask Edge Loop Complete from the ZModeler and then scale it in the X-axis. Switch it over to Inset Flat Island to introduce a new polygroup. Unmask the polygroup and run a Polish by Features a few times until it's a circle. Polish by Features is tucked away in the Tool palette under the Deformation menu. Now we can Q-mesh that polygroup inward. Select the polygroup and invert the selection, then delete hidden. For the polygon action, switch it to do nothing. For the edge action, change it to bridge. Target will be 2 holes and 1 line. Switch the edge action to insert with multiple edge loops for the target. Press QC50 and then Ctrl W to group visible. Let's wrap this part up by making a few tiny adjustments to the creasing. Alright, let's dive into creating the brace that keeps the front forks and brakes in place. Control click on the canvas to mask the object, head to the gear and select Cylinder 3D with an H divides of 100. Control click the canvas to invert the mask and split unmasked points. Rotate and scale them into place. Now we can turn off all the other subtools so we can focus solely on this piece without any distractions. Scale it up a bit and mask the top faces. Lengthen the cylinder, then Control drag to extrude. Scale it down a little and extrude it again using the gizmo. Then we can clear the mask, then Control click on the canvas to mask everything. Bring in another cylinder from the gizmo, rotate it 90 degrees in the X-axis and scale it up. The reason I always mask the model before adding primitives from the gizmo is because when masked, it'll add the primitive to the subtool. When it's unmasked, it'll replace the subtool. Another upside of using the gizmo for adding primitives, rather than other methods, is that it lets me set the location and orientation of those primitives based on the gizmo's orientation and position. Also, the modifications of these primitives are in the form of cones right next to the newly created primitive, not on the side of the UI. This keeps me right in the heart of the action. For me, it's all about keeping the flow going. If I have to go to the side of the UI to adjust primitives, or as in other applications, stop to input a value every time I perform a box modeling operation, it disrupts the rhythm and slows everything down. Of course, everyone has their own style. It's just the way I like to work. Now it's time for a second cube. Move it out and scale it down. We can now use masking and the gizmo to start molding the shape. Go ahead and mask everything and bring in another cube from the gizmo. Just like before, use the gizmo and masking to create the form. Grab the slice brush and add an edge loop right between the meshes. Then Q-mesh a single poly. Control-click the canvas to mask everything and bring in a cylinder from the gizmo. Now we can scale and rotate it to match the reference. So the game plan here is to set up some low poly primitives to block out the basic shapes. After that, we're going to blend them all together with Dynamesh and continue to model using sculpting techniques. While we're doing that, let's have a very quick discussion about how to avoid limiting potential growth. So far, we've already seen a couple of different workflows when tackling these motorcycle parts. And it's still very early in the project. So what I like to do, and have done since I started modeling in ZBrush, is to learn as many tools and features as I can and put them into practice. And the more time you spend in the lab, the more you'll figure out which workflows and features gives you the best results. Also, when you're hunting down modeling techniques online, don't limit your search to just software you're learning. You'll be amazed by the amount of knowledge you can pick up from tutorials of different softwares. Before I switched over to modeling in ZBrush 4R7, I had about 5 to 6 years of experience with Blender and Maya. A lot of the fundamentals and workflows I learned from those previous softwares I was able to bring into ZBrush. And once I got into a good rhythm and ZBrush started adding new modeling features with every new release, the search for knowledge didn't just stop with ZBrush only. I would watch tutorials for all these other modeling packages thinking, okay, so this is how they do it in this software. So now I would envision how I could achieve the same thing in ZBrush using a particular tool, brush, feature, or a slight difference in technique. I get that there are a variety of reasons why you might use a specific modeling software. It could be due to a client, a studio, what you were taught. It could be personal preferences, financial reasons, or the final destination of the model. The 3D industry isn't just about film and games. There are so many different fields in which 3D is utilized, and this could be a major factor in which software you use. But the key point I want to hammer home is this: no matter what software you use for modeling, and for whatever reason, don't limit your search to that specific software. There are so many experts and masters using different modeling packages. By not tapping into the knowledge they're sharing, you're only holding yourself back. Alright, now that we've got a solid blockout from our primitives, it's time to add in the subtractive meshes. Press Ctrl and click on the canvas to mask the model. Press W to bring up the gizmo. We want it positioned in the middle of the cylinder. I'm using the white circle to quickly align it. Click on the gear from the gizmo and bring in a cylinder 3D. Scale it up and split it into a new subtool. Let's turn off dynamic and rotate it 90 degrees. Start scaling in the Z-axis. But here's the trick. Hold Alt while scaling to scale it in both the X and Y axis instead. Once we are finished positioning the cylinder, hold Ctrl and move the model with the gizmo to duplicate it. Rotate it 90 degrees on the Y-axis and make the necessary adjustments. Again, we want to hold Control and move the cylinder with the gizmo to duplicate it. This time, we're looking to create 2 small holes in the front for the bolts. Once we're done scaling and positioning, click on the subtractive icon in the subtool list. Then turn on Live Boolean. Just a reminder to make sure your subtractive subtool is sitting below the base subtool. Go ahead and take a few minutes to look around to make sure everything is looking good. Press Shift F to turn on Polyframe. Press W to bring up the gizmo, and from the gear, select the polycube. Move it down and scale it to match the reference. Once you start getting the hang of this workflow, it becomes a super fun and quick process. Alright, now let's select our base subtool and turn off the eye icon for the subtractive subtool. Before we dive into dynameshing the model, I'm going to make a few adjustments to the mesh with the Move Infinite Depth brush. Let's apply the dynamic subdivisions and delete the lower subdivisions. With the Dynamesh utility, set the poly count to 0.5, which equals around 500,000, set the blur to 0, and press Use Auto Scaler. After you run the Dynamesh utility, ZBrush will automatically enable the default Dynamesh. So what I usually do right after setting the poly count with the Dynamesh utility is to match that with the resolution in Dynamesh. This can be done by making sure the closed circle in the resolution slider is open, and then click and dragging the picker to the mesh. That way, the poly count I choose for the Dynamesh utility carries over to the default Dynamesh resolution. Now we can turn back on the subtractive subtool to see how it's looking. Let's go back to the subtool menu and merge the base down with the subtractive. If done correctly, your subtractive mesh will have a white polyframe color. Just a heads up, a white polyframe color represents a subtractive mesh in the Dynamesh world. Now we can run a polish open circle to clean up some of these edges. For the next step, I want to align the cylinder to the camera. I could use the gizmo to help with this process, but there is a slight tilt I need for the angle to get this looking correct. Let's go ahead and drag out a mask rectangle, and then clean up any unwanted extra masking. A good brush for masking in tight spaces is the Mask Curve brush. Now I can line up the gizmo and scale it in the Y-axis. Clear the mask by control dragging on the canvas. Control dragging on the canvas again to run a Dynamesh. Let's go ahead and repeat the process for the bottom cylinder. You'll notice it's a bit challenging to get the masking just right. I'm trying to create a straight edge for the mask when viewing it from the side, which will make masking cleanup much easier. Once done, control click on the canvas to invert the mask, then control click on the model to blur the mask. Bring up the gizmo and scale it in the Y-axis. Control drag on the canvas to clear the mask, then control drag on the canvas again to Dynamesh. Now we can switch to the mask curve brush, which I find great for more precise and controlled masking. It's similar to other curve brushes in functionality and hotkeys. Control key to mask, Control and Alt key to unmask. The grading is where the masking happens. After drawing the line, use the spacebar to move it. Single tap Alt to add a curve. Double tap Alt for a sharp angle. And pressing Shift after the line is drawn to activate snapping. Now we're going to use the Clip Curve brush to move everything that's unmasked to the Clip Curve line. Control drag on the canvas to clear the mask, and once more, control and drag on the canvas to Dynamesh. Run a quick polish to clean up some of the harshness. We're going to go ahead and repeat the same steps for the bottom. Once the masking is done, bring up the Clip Curve brush to move the unmasked area to the Clip Curve line. Control drag on the canvas to clear the mask, control drag on the canvas again to Dynamesh. Then we can run a quick polish to clean up some of the harshness. Now we can switch to the planar brush and fix some of these plane changes. I know I use a lot of ZModeler and work with lower poly geometry, but if I'm being completely honest, hard surface in ZBrush is at its most enjoyable when sculpting in high poly. It's an absolute beast when combining hard surface sculpting with concepting. For me, there's this liberating feeling where you can be more relaxed and carefree during the process. Plus, the speed at which you can create complex shapes is truly incredible. Even if excellent topology is required, in some situations and depending on the complexity of the model, it is faster to sculpt and then manually retopple rather than box modeling. Another great brush I often use is the planar rect brush, which does a quick job of flattening surfaces. Now we can start clipping down some of these ends to make them look more machined. Run the polish slider for a bit of cleanup work. Grab the mask pen and roughly sketch out the hole based on the reference. Now we can switch to the mask curve brush and clean up the edges. You don't have to get it perfect at this stage, we'll clean it up later. Control Alt and click the mesh to sharpen the mask. Now we can press Control W to group visible. Going to the subtool menu, press Duplicate. Control Shift and click on the polygroup to select it, then delete hidden. Run a polish by features with an open circle to clean up the outer edge. Then click on Extrude from Ryan's Tools to give it some thickness. Go ahead and bring up the gizmo and move it down a bit. Set this subtool to subtractive and turn on live boolean. Run a polish by features again to clean up any waviness from the extrusion. The last thing we need to do is merge them together and Dynamesh, just like we did before. Next up, we're going to be working on the front suspension. Let's go ahead and mask the model. From the Gizmo's Gear menu, bring in a Cylinder 3D. Split the mask points and turn on Dynamic. Set the smooth subdivisions to 4 and the crease level to 3. Scale it down and unmask the top cap. Hold Ctrl and move with the gizmo to duplicate. Now we can scale up the new cylinder. Go ahead and mask the top cap and move the cylinder. Next we want to clear the mask and turn off Dynamic. Add in 4 edge loops. And set the polygon action in ZModeler to polygroup and the target to polyloop. Now we want to switch it to QMesh Polygroup Island. Then we can go back and change the polygroup for the last 2 polygroups. Let's go ahead and QMesh that polygroup while holding the Shift key to make it a move operation. Finally, QMesh that last polyloop. When deleting edge loops, sometimes you'll get a crease on the remaining edges. That happens when you click toward the middle of the edge during deletion. Instead, try clicking toward the ends and the remaining edges won't be creased. Press QC50 and make some final creasing adjustments. Sliding edge loops of a very short extrusion will help capture more light in the render. Do a QMesh polyloop and hold Ctrl to separate the faces. Let's go ahead and separate the island into a new subtool. Now we can QMesh the polygroup island and hold Shift to move it up a little. Then QMesh it again to add some thickness. Now from the ZModeler brush, choose Slide Edge Loop Complete to taper the end. Switch to Insert Multiple Edge Loops with Interactive Elevation. Go ahead and remove the creasing from the 2 edge loops and turn on Dynamic. Give it a little bit more thickness on top with QMesh. Then merge it down and give it a single polygroup. Let's add some edge loops and then remove the unwanted creasing. To finish off this piece, let's flip it in the x-axis, which is basically the same thing as the mirror action, and then go ahead and click on Instance from Ryan's Tools. Now we can repeat the same steps for the subtool below.